Hi class, today we're going to look at biomolecule number 2, which is lipids, also called fats commonly. So first we looked at carbohydrates, that was our first biomolecule. Now we're looking at lipids, then we will look at proteins, and finally we'll look at nucleic acids really quickly this semester, and we'll get back to it at the end of the year when we talk more about genetics. So here are some foods that are high in lipids, also called fats. So we have meats like bacon, chicken skin, pork rinds, those are all really high in fats. Really, anytime we look at meat and we can see this white part, so this white part is the lipid, so that's the fat on the meat. Also things like butter, shortening, margarine, any type of oil, whole milk, egg yolks, and cheese are all high in fats. And fats should be about 15 to 20% of our diet. So we definitely should be eating some fats. So fats actually contain more calories per gram than carbohydrates. So they have more condensed energy. They also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates. But they have a few different characteristics as well. So first, they're not very soluble in water, so they don't dissolve. In fact, they tend to separate out of water, just like if you pour water and oil together to make like some sort of salad dressing or to make cookies or something, they'll separate. But we should also know that the ratio of carbon, hydrogen to oxygen is different from carbohydrates. So we have a much, much, much lower quantity of oxygens, especially when we're looking at the ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. So we don't have that CH2O that some of us noticed in the carbohydrates. Instead, we have way more hydrogens and only a few oxygens making up the molecules. So the building blocks of lipids are called fatty acids and glycerol. So there's two different parts. So this is just showing a glycerol molecule forming a chemical bond with a fatty acid chain. So if we look, we see something that's familiar. So we see that we're losing a hydrogen from one of the molecules, and we're losing the H and the O from the other molecule. So we're forming a water in the process of forming this chemical bond. So it would be considered as well a dehydration bond, a dehydration synthesis bond. Okay, so we're just combining the glycerol and the fatty acid. Okay, so why do we have fats? So one is it's stored energy. So if you run out of the stored carbohydrates as glycogen within your body, then your body will depend on fats, okay, as their next option to fuel themselves. So to fuel the body and to get energy, it'll start breaking down fats. It's also cushion, and it also counts as warmth and insulation. So it's actually good to have a little bit of fat so that if you were to fall, okay, you have some extra cushioning so you don't instantly bruise or break. And many animals depend on lipids to keep them warm. So a lot of these sea animals like whales and seals, they actually have a lot of fat or blubber, and blubber helps to insulate them. Even if their surrounding environment or the water is very, very cold, they can still have a high inner body temperature, core body temperature, through the insulation of fats. So there's three main types of lipids. So one is triglycerides, which are also called fats. Two is phospholipids, and three is sterols. So we're first going to take a look at the triglycerides or fats. So these are all types of triglycerides or fats. Within the group of triglycerides or fats, there's a few subgroups. So the first one is saturated fats or saturated triglycerides. So these are things that are solid at room temperature. So if you think about a stick of butter would be solid at room temperature. Lard, which is meat fat, okay, is solid at room temperature. So is cheese. These tend to be animal products and are considered, somewhat unhealthy if we're eating them in really, really, really high quantities. But of course, they're fine to eat in, moderate quantities. That's totally fine. If we look at the molecule for saturated fats, they're called saturated fats because everywhere where we could form a bond between carbon and hydrogen, there is that bond between carbon and hydrogen. So the chain is actually really, really straight, and there's no double bonds, so 0 double bonds between the main chain of carbon atoms. So this is why it's called saturated. It's actually saturated with hydrogen atoms. Then we look at unsaturated fats. So unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. They tend to be plant or vegetable products. So that would consist of olive oil, peanut oil, sunflower oil, flaxseed oil. Okay, a lot of those things that we just consider oils to cook with. And they are referred to as unsaturated because if we look at the chain, so that fatty acid chain, it's not saturated with hydrogens. So in some places where we could potentially have another hydrogen, like here, we actually see that the hydrogen is removed and there's a double bond between the carbons. So this actually leads to a chain that's got some bends in it. Okay, so it's got some bends. And this is one of the reasons why it's liquid at room temperature. It's because the molecules themselves cannot pack together as closely because they are more bent and kinked. It's harder to get them nicely packed up and close together to form a solid. Finally, we have something called hydrogenated fats. So hydrogenated fats are also solid at room temperature. And these are unnatural products, so they are considered unhealthy and unnatural. They're produced by people. So what you do is you start with a plant-based product. So you start with something like a vegetable oil, and then in the factory we like blast it. So we shoot a whole bunch of hydrogen at it. And the hydrogen, okay, then binds to some of the carbons to hydrogenate the molecules, so to add hydrogen to the molecules. And this is just considered very unhealthy because it's unnatural. But one of the good things about these products is that they prolong the shelf life of food. So it allows food to last much, much longer. So good examples of this would be vegetable shortening, which is white if you cook with it. Sometimes people cook with it if they make pastries, or margarine. So now we're moving on from the triglycerides and the fats to the phospholipids. So phospholipids are prevalent within our bodies. They make up all of our cell membranes. So every single cell in your body is defined by an exterior membrane that's made primarily of phospholipids. So when you're taking notes, you should draw little phospholipids. So they always look like this. You can leave the eyes off, but they always have a head that contains a phosphate group, so it contains phosphorus, and then it has 2 fatty acid tails coming off of it. And if you look, the cell membrane always has a bilayer or 2 layers. And you can see that on the outside we always have our phosphate group, our phosphate head, and then on the inside we have those fatty acid tails. And one of the reasons for this is that the fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, so they really don't like water. So they always try and avoid water. Right? And there's a lot of water within our body, which we know. So in our cells, there's a lot of water. So they want to hide those fatty acid tails by kind of creating this fortress where they have this 2-layer, where they have the 2 layers of the membrane. The last type of lipid is sterol. And sterols are also known as, so AKA is also known as steroids. So steroids actually have these rings of fatty acids. So you can see here these rings. Okay, this one has 4 different rings connected. And they include things like cholesterol, which you hear a lot about, vitamin D, and many, many, many hormones within our body, including all of our sex hormones, which is testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. So hormone production regulations. Hormones are extremely important within our body. They send these longer distance signals, so from one area to the body to a completely different area of the body, and those hormones travel through our bloodstream. So most hormones are protein-based. However, The sex hormones are all lipid-based, so they all start with a sterol. Our sex hormone production is controlled by this really tiny gland called the pituitary gland. It's about the size of a pea, deep within your brain. And that just regulates the amount of hormones being released and when they're being released as you hit puberty and then throughout your adult life. So the other thing that the pituitary gland does is it produces growth hormone. So growth hormone, the human growth hormone, allows you to grow taller and bigger throughout your entire lifetime. And then again, the sex hormones. And I added here a picture of estrogen, which is one of the female sex hormones, and testosterone, so one of the male, considered the male sex hormone. And if you look, okay, just looking at the structure of them, they're actually really closely related. So obviously they have different impacts on our human development, but if we look at the molecules, they're extremely similar. Okay, but even those small differences make a huge impact on their functionality. So I want to zoom into cholesterol because cholesterol we hear a lot about and we'll look at in detail next week. So cholesterol is the most abundant sterol within our body. We actually do need it, so it comes from our diet. You can get it from egg yolks, and it is processed within your liver, made within your liver. It's used to repair the cell membrane, so there are cholesterol molecules within the cell membrane, but also to make hormones. So this is cholesterol. You can see it looks similar. I'll go back. It looks similar to the sex hormones on this page, but we can see it has this additional fatty acid chain off to the side. So your body can modify the cholesterol and transform it into other types of hormones. Now, cholesterol gets, I think, a very bad reputation, but in fact, there are actually two different types of cholesterol. Okay, so we have cholesterol, okay, which is a lipid primarily, but in order for it to be able to move through the bloodstream, because the bloodstream is made primarily of water, like 85% of your blood is water, so it wouldn't be able to dissolve well within the blood unless it has some type of package to allow it to move through the blood with ease. So in fact, cholesterol is considered a lipolipid protein, so lipoprotein. It's packaged in protein, which allows it to move better throughout the body because proteins are more soluble in water. So we have two types. We have high-density lipoprotein. This is considered our good cholesterol. The good cholesterol can actually pick up extra cholesterol and drop it off in the liver to be processed. And then we have something called low-density lipoprotein, which is considered bad cholesterol, and that carries cholesterol to the cells. So bad cholesterol, if we have too much of our low density lipoprotein, it could get stuck or trapped in our blood vessels and build up something called plaque. So then if we have this buildup of plaque in our blood vessels, as you can imagine, like you can think of if you had plumbing in your house and it had a big blockage in it, then we're going to have trouble with the flow of blood, and that can be extremely dangerous. So that can lead to cardiovascular problems, heart problems, stroke, etc. So we want to make sure that we're not having these buildups of plaque due to the low density lipoproteins. So here's a few questions just to check your understanding. Okay, so I'm just going to show you them. You can take a guess. And then if you have any questions, we can talk about them the next day in class, okay? So which of the following is not a characteristic of lipids? So we're looking for which one's false. 2, which one is not a lipid? So going back and thinking about the classifications for lipids. Next one. Which statement best describes the role of cholesterol in the body? And we'll talk extensively about cholesterol next week. My last one. So which example below is the best example of an unsaturated fat? So if you're not sure, go back and look at those slides about the foods and which ones belong to the unsaturated fat group. Okay. All right, so if you're not sure, you have questions, make sure you bring them to our next class, all right? Bye.